Hey everybody, it's April 13th, which means it's officially Homestuck Day. Homestuck is 11 years old. I am now with some people who are a little bit older than that. Carson, you said you don't know anything about Homestuck.
I do not.
Okay, ask me any question about Homestuck and I'll try to answer to the best of my ability.
What was it about?
Homestuck was about four kids who were playing a video game, but the video game is also the origin story of the universe, so it becomes a religious piece. And this is first really foreshadowed when one of them enters the game, and to do so, he has to bite into an apple that grew on a tree in front of him. It's at that point where he starts learning about what the game mechanics are.
Hmm.
It's it has what's the word I'm looking? The opposite of parallel. Perpendicular gameplay, I guess, is the correct term. Basically, you have to have an even amount of players, and one player will start out by going into the game, and like monsters will attack them, but they're still basically in their house. The other
Mhm.
player gets control of like a Sims building style game from their computer where they can start building player one's house. And the initial goal is to get their house to be very tall and towards like a portal that player one can then jump through. So you
Mhm.
have the perpendicular gameplay style, and then eventually, like, it doesn't matter how many people you have on like the game. So you can have like four players, player one, player two, like I just explained, player three. Then it has like the Sims house builder for player two to help them into the game. Player four helps player three, and it loops back around to the point where player one is eventually doing the Sims building for the last player in the session.
Mm.
Once they're all in the game, they start unlocking different quests, and each player's gameplay is going to be slightly different. It's tailored to their own personality style, which
Mhm.
are defined by a class and an aspect. So, for example, let's say John. John is the heir of breath, which the heir class is like he inherits everything, and then breath is like the idea of freedom of expression while also walking away from actual storytelling techniques. So John basically inherits the ability to break canon, but
Hmm.
he's a weird example. Some a better example would be like Dave, who is the Knight of Time. He has the class of Knight, which is somebody who serves your fellow teammates, somebody who fights on their behalf and tries to protect them. Whereas the aspect of time basically grants him the ability of time travel. So, being the Knight of Time, his role in the story is essentially to time travel around in such a way that serves his fellow teammates and tries to help further along towards the end goal.
Mhm.
Do you have any other questions?
How long did Homestuck run for?
Homestuck ran for 7 acts. So, Act 1 lasted about a couple of months. And then there's Act 2, which Act 1 is entirely from John's perspective, so you don't even really see any of the other characters. It's all telling like all of the gameplay storyline from John's perspective. Once he's in the game, Act 2 starts and they start introducing the other characters. Act 5 took an entire year.
Yeah.
I think overall the story lasted 7 years.
That is very cool.
Yeah. They updated almost every day, sometimes multiple times per day. Technically, if you really want to think about it, they have a sequel series that just started, and that one updates about once a month and is on chapter 4. Its story, and that's Homestuck 2 or Homestuck Squared. It's weird. They have the word Homestuck and then has the 2 top there, but they had basically all of Homestuck, which lasted 7 years. They waited a year or two. They had the Homestuck epilogue, which is a physical book that you can buy in stores. That has a prologue and then splits into two halves, which are completely entirely different stories that all have the same characters. But then near the end, it interacts, and it's fucking confusing. And then
Hmm.
Homestuck 2, the current thing, is a sequel to the epilogue. So it follows like the characters, but you have to remember, okay, well, this is the one from this timeline, and this is the John from the other timeline who is doing different things.
Hmm.
Yeah. The trolls are a major thing in Homestuck. I'm sure you've seen them.
Are they the ones with the orange horns?
Yeah, the candy corn horns.
Hmm.
So there were 12 trolls in the Homestuck mythos that are mostly important. There's a lot of others, but these 12 are the main important. They're introduced in Act 4, but mostly are in Act 5. Act 5 is the first half of Act 5 lasted an entire year, and that was just all the trolls. Basically, the author of the story was writing about these four kids, and then he had to explain like the grander lore and give counter examples to what the actual gameplay mechanics are. So he introduced these 12 characters, each based off a different one of the zodiac signs. These 12 trolls ended up creating the universe that the four kids lived in, and that's basically the end goal of the game. Each game has a different name depending on where it is, but usually it's like S-burb, like suburb, or
Hmm.
S-grub for the trolls.
Hmm.
So the trolls are an interesting case because they got the closest to winning a regular game,
Yeah.
and they ended up creating their own universe, which is where the kids came from. The trolls uh, were battling like the main actual boss, which is supposed to be the Black King. Imagine basically a giant game of chess.
Hmm.
The players are supposed to be fighting on the white side and eventually have to take out the Black King on the other side of the chessboard. But as each player enters into their session, it makes that chessboard larger and more complicated until by the time the last person has entered, the chessboard is now a gigantic planet all to itself with all of these complex communities within. So the more players that you play with, the more complicated the game will be.
Mm.
So the trolls are trying to defeat the Black King and even end up doing so, but then when they created the world that the humans came from, there was a
Hmm.
glitch in the human game, and that sent one of their final bosses all the way into the troll session and just fucked them up.
Ah.
So that character is Jack Noir, is so the chess motif is like the main thing, but then there are also these sub games that are all going on at the same time, like a game of billiards. So you have like the felt and a cue ball, and then on top of that, you also have like a game of cards. So Jack Noir is supposed to be the spades, like the ace of spades from the deck of cards. So the trolls were playing a giant game of chess, and then suddenly, right before they could claim their trophy, like six different games also started at the same time, and they're like, "Ah, shit, let's hang back and maybe pester these kids, the four from the planet that we."
Hmm. I think that's all my questions answered. Thank you.
Don't you want to know anything else?
What?
Um.
Can I ask mean questions?
You can ask any question you want.
Why is the fandom so hated?
That's a very good question. Homestuck fandom is very niche to the point where they had all of these in jokes that they understood, but nobody else really understood. So when they all went to conventions, they would just do terrible, terrible things with each other. One of those things was the trolls are a completely different species to human, and therefore their reproductive system is basically oblique and ambiguous. But what they do have is each of them has like a different color bodily fluid, like red blood or blue blood. And part of the comic, one of the in jokes basically developed into the idea that these large imperial guards would come and collect materials from all of these different trolls to be mixed together and then this that way, and they would do so
Mhm.
with a large bucket. Now, The comic doesn't necessarily say what the fluids were, and it's pretty heavily implied though that it was blood. But because it's left ambiguous to just the term bodily fluids, a lot of the Homestuck fan base took that as meaning everybody spits in a bucket. So during some of these conventions, a bunch of the Homestuck cosplayers would take a bucket out and just all take turns spitting in it,
Ah, I can
which
see
is
why.
pretty gross. Another
It
thing is
is.
the Homestuck, the trolls are very similar to humans. They stand on two legs, they wear basically t-shirts, they have the horns, which are pretty easy to do, and then they have like gray skin. So a lot of the cosplayers wanted something easy to start with, so you just get yourself a black t-shirt, a black wig, some cheap plastic horns, and then gray face paint and body paint.
Hmm.
But one of the problems is nobody thought to seal up their body paint, face paint, which is something that you're supposed to do, but a lot of these people were amateurs and had never done cosplay before. As a as an unintended side effect of this, you could tell whichever conventions had Homestuck cosplayers because there were gray handprints on everything.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So a lot of these conventions were being held at large hotels like Marriott hotels, or at least that's where all of the people would go afterwards. And very quickly, because of all the gray handprints that were becoming a real pain to clean up, and all the stories about them spitting in buckets, a lot of these convention places would have signs up saying no Homestuck cosplayers allowed, trying to basically say, hey, don't get paint everywhere. But of course, Homestuck cosplayers took that as like a sign of aggression and decided, oh, well, if you're going to say that about our cosplay, what we need to do is be sneaky about it or try to do it even harder. So then that developed into other in jokes on the Homestuck forums until it got to a turning point where even the author of the story, Andrew Hussey, stepped back and said, no, Homestuck cosplayers are terrible people. I don't want to deal with them. In the Kickstarter page that was made in 2013, I believe, no, 2012, Andrew Hussey has a picture of Homestuck cosplayers with a very annoyed person in the background staring at them, and he posts on the Kickstarter, "These people are called Homestucks. They like to dress in silly outfits." I think,
Silly outfits. That's an interesting way of describing it.
yeah, I think that's the most positive thing that he's ever said about the cosplay community.
Mm. So, if they knew what they were doing with the body paint,
Uh,
they wouldn't have been hated as much, would they?
yeah, if they sealed their body paint, they wouldn't have been hated as much, or if they just didn't do the bucket thing, or if they certain in jokes and running gags in Homestuck were basically violent in nature. Like the bucket itself was thrown at one of the characters, so people took that as like, oh, if you're dressed as that character, I can throw this metal bucket at you as a funny haha joke. And
That
not
didn't go well,
everybody
did it?
was not everybody was in on that joke.
You just mind your own business, then you get hit by a bucket.
Yeah, exactly.
Why
So
the fuck would you do that?
that's why most of the Homestuck
Yeah.
cosplay community and convention going community was hated. As for the
Ah,
other communities, because Homestuck references so many other things, if you were to reference something that Homestuck had also referenced, even inadvertently, on public forums such as Twitter or Facebook or Tumblr, especially Tumblr, people would dogpile on you and just say, "Wow, that's a Homestuck reference. I didn't know you were a Homestuck." It just,
my god.
it's
Yeah,
ridiculous. It
it
also
is.
it also doesn't help that each of the 12 trolls were based on different internet going archetypes around at the time. So some
What
of
does
them,
that mean?
uh, one of the trolls is designed to just be like a juggalo. He types in interwoven like uppercase, lowercase lettering, and
Oh,
he's a juggalo.
no.
He talks about being down with the clown and gets high.
Yeah.
He also becomes one of the bigger serial killers in the story, but it's neither here nor there. But
Yeah.
because so one of them is based on like shipping, So, like, oh, I ship these two characters. I think they're in love. Andrew Hussey was really fond of this and thought it was hilarious, so he introduced a like, four symbol shipping grid that you can use for all these characters, and then has a character whose entire existence basically boils down to explaining what that is. So instead of just saying like this character heart, this character, you have all four of the card suits. Like spade means that like they hate each other. Club is like this weird three-way thing where one character comes in and breaks up a fight, and for some reason that's an entire relationship goal for them. And
Wow.
then diamond, which is like platonic friendship where they protect each other from themselves or others, which is like, I don't know. I can't think of a good analogy for that one right now. Off the back of my head now.
Mm.
I guess Tobias and Axe from Animorphs. I don't know. Or Rick and Morty would be a good example of diamonds, where they're obviously not in love with each other, but they got each other's back, sort of thing.
Yeah, like a healthy relationship that people aren't allowed to mess up.
Yeah,
Don't sexualize him and his grandson.
Rick and Morty is actually a really good example of this because it's not necessarily a healthy relationship. Like, Morty is basically not allowed to do anything unless Rick tells him to, and then Rick sometimes be halted by Morty's actions as well. That's a pretty good
But
example.
then, but Morty does get fed up with it sometimes, and just kind of he's more independent. Goes against Rick or something.
Certain characters were introduced to basically be one of the relationship grid. So like you have two characters that are introduced as an example of what Diamond is, as well as another two characters that are equally representative of that category, just so that expectations could then be subverted and show like how each one is a bad example at the same time as a good example.
Hmm.
Hussey, the main writer for Homestuck, also loved throwing in different religious allegories to the point where each of the kids, this was written around 2009 when it started, had their own preferred internet browser. Right now, I think everybody is just agreeing that Chrome is the best one, right?
Hmm.
But back then, people had like Mozilla Firefox or Safari, all these different. So Hussey ended up having them each have their own different web browser as well as all of their different characteristics and interests. And the web browsers were actually named after ancient like snake gods. Later on in the story, each of them would have to find and talk to and try to do a certain quest that only they would be given by the snake god creature like Echidna or Yellow.
Mm.
And so you have all these like interwoven metaphors and analogies in what is essentially a religious creation mythos. And it's really interesting, but at the same time you have characters who are like so stupid. Hate it.
Mm.
I think the best description I've ever seen from like a Homestuck fan was I hate everything that's happening and I love to hate it.
Hmm.
I don't think
That's
anyone
great.
I don't think anyone actually likes Homestuck.
I mean, there is a fan base. There's a fan base for pretty much anything. So you can't really say that. Although, oh.
Would
By the way, is this being recorded?
Oh yeah, we're 20 minutes in.
Ah, okay. So you can cut out this part of me just saying, is this
No,
recorded?
no, I
Oh,
think that's gonna be the end of the video.
okay.
I'm not editing this. This is just it. This is fine.
Ah.
Homestuck.